Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. It's going to be a fascinating one. We're going to be looking at a chapter of the Cold War that often gets overlooked. We're zeroing in on Latin America, specifically how the U.S. tried to contain communism there.
Yeah.
And, I always thought the Marshall Plan was a purely European thing.
Yeah.
But clearly, it had ripple effects across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about it. While Europe was getting billions in aid,
Right.
Latin America felt pretty much left out in the cold.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that feeling of being sidelined, it really shaped how Latin American countries viewed their relationship with the U.S. during this period.
And that's what makes this deep dive so intriguing. We're using a lecture designed for IBTP history students as our source. So we're going deep with material.
Oh, wow.
Meant for serious learning.
Yeah.
And you're deep into IB history.
I am.
Which means you know your stuff.
I try to.
Uh-huh. But even those textbooks don't always tell the whole story.
Oh, absolutely not.
That's why we're going beyond the facts and really unpacking the complexities of U.S. containment policy in Latin America.
Absolutely. It's a topic ripe with what-ifs and unintended consequences.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Early on in the Cold War, the U.S. wasn't overly concerned about Soviet influence in Latin America. It seemed pretty stable, right?
Okay.
Influenced by the Catholic Church, existing regimes seemed to have things under control. Plus, it felt geographically distant from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So where did things start to shift?
Well, as the Cold War intensified, so did U.S. anxieties.
Okay.
They became increasingly worried about leftist ideologies, especially communism, taking root south of the border. Remember, this was a time of intense ideological rivalry. The U.S. genuinely believed that communism was a global threat. They feared a domino effect, with one country after another falling under Soviet influence.
So they ditched the hands-off approach.
Exactly. They started actively trying to shape the political landscape in Latin America.
Wow.
And that meant supporting anyone who stood firmly against communism, even if their commitment to democracy was, let's say, questionable.
Wow. Supporting leaders with shaky democratic credentials. Seems like they were playing with fire there.
It was a gamble, and the implications are still debated today by historians. Some argue it was a necessary evil to prevent the spread of communism. Others contend it backfired, creating long-term instability and fueling resentment towards the U.S.
The lecture gives the example of Juan Perón in Argentina. He was a populist leader, cracking down on communists, but not exactly a poster child for democracy. What's the takeaway from that complicated relationship with the U.S.?
Perón's case highlights the pragmatism of U.S. policy at the time. They weren't necessarily looking for democratic allies. They were looking for partners in the fight against communism. And that meant working with a range of leaders, from military dictators to populist strongmen, regardless of their domestic policies.
So a common enemy makes for strange bedfellows, as they say.
Okay.
And their actions weren't limited to supporting individual leaders. The U.S. went all in on creating a more formal security structure in the region, right?
Yes. And this is where we see the emergence of agreements like the Act of Chapultepec and the Rio Treaty.
Okay, break those down for us. They sound pretty important.
The Act of Chapultepec, signed in 1945, was a stepping stone towards a hemispheric defense alliance. It declared that an attack against one country in the Americas would be considered an attack against all that. This set the stage for deeper military cooperation and paved the way for the Rio Treaty in 1947.
Ah, the Rio Treaty. Now that one sounds familiar. Wasn't that essentially the Western Hemisphere's version of NATO?
Precisely. It solidified a collective defense agreement for the Americas, which was a huge win for the U.S. It gave them a legal framework for intervening in Latin American countries under the guise of anti-communism.
And it's incredible to think how these Cold War agreements continue to shape global politics today.
It is.
But hold on, we've got military support, we've got alliances, but what about the economic side of things? That's where the missing Marshall Plan comes into play, right?
You've hit on a crucial point. While Europe was receiving massive economic aid through the Marshall Plan,
Right.
Latin America was largely left out, and this perceived neglect fueled a lot of resentment towards the U.S. It created this sense of double standards, like Latin American countries were being treated as second-class allies.
And some leaders at the time, like Brazil's Eurico Gaspar Dutra and Chile's Gabriel González Videla, were sounding the alarm bells, weren't they? They argued that this lack of economic support could actually push Latin America towards communism.
That's right. They were making a compelling argument that poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity create fertile ground for radical ideologies to take root.
Which seems pretty obvious, right? If people are struggling to survive, they might be more open to radical solutions regardless of where those solutions are coming from.
Precisely. And their warnings were largely ignored. The U.S. remained focused on containing communism through primarily military and political means.
So in trying to prevent the spread of communism, they might have actually created conditions that made it more likely to spread. It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of prioritizing short-term goals.
It certainly does, and that's something we'll delve deeper into as we continue this deep dive. But before we get into the implications of this missing Marshall Plan, I think it's helpful to understand how historians view this period.
Right. The lecture introduces us to four main schools of thought: Orthodox Revisionist, Post-Revisionist, and New Left. It's amazing how perspective can shape our understanding of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. And each of these perspectives offers a unique lens through which to view U.S. containment policy in Latin America. Let's start with the Orthodox view, which is kind of like the classic good guys versus bad guys narrative. They argue that U.S. actions were a necessary response to Soviet aggression and a genuine attempt to protect democracy and free markets in the region.
Okay, so the U.S. is the hero of the story, but then the revisionists come in and say, hold on, maybe it's not that simple.
Exactly. The revisionist historians take a more critical stance. They argue that the U.S. used the Cold War as a pretext to advance its own economic and political interests in Latin America, often at the expense of the people they claim to be helping.
So less about spreading freedom, more about maintaining control. That's a pretty different interpretation.
It is. And then we have the post-revisionists trying to find a middle ground. They acknowledge that the U.S. had legitimate concerns about Soviet influence, but also recognize that their policies were often self-serving and had negative consequences for Latin America.
Sounds like a more nuanced perspective. And what about the New Left historians? Where do they fit into all of this?
They focus on the impact of U.S. interventions on Latin American societies, arguing that U.S. support for authoritarian regimes actually stifled democratic movements, increased inequality, and led to human rights abuses.
So four very different ways of looking at the same historical events, which just goes to show there's rarely one definitive answer when it comes to history, is there?
That's one of the things that makes it so fascinating. And understanding these multiple perspectives is key to grasping the complexities of the Cold War in Latin America.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. Yeah, we have. We've laid the groundwork.
For understanding just how tangled the web of Cold War politics and economics really was in Latin America.
It really does feel like we're peeling back layers of history here, and I'm eager to keep digging. Speaking of digging deeper, let's circle back to that missing Marshall Plan for Latin America. It feels like that decision had a ripple effect on everything else we've been talking about.
You're absolutely right. The lack of significant economic aid comparable to what Europe received had both short-term and long-term repercussions. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Latin American economies were struggling. Remember, they had contributed to the Allied war effort, supplying raw materials, even sending troops in some cases, and they expected some reciprocal support to help them rebuild and modernize.
Yeah, like, hey, we were on the same team, remember? It seems like a reasonable expectation.
It does, but unfortunately the U.S. had a different set of priorities. They saw Europe as the front line in the Cold War and believed that pouring resources into rebuilding Western European economies would make them less susceptible to communist influence.
So a strategic decision based on where they perceived the greatest threat to be, but at what cost?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This perceived neglect by the U.S. fueled a lot of resentment in Latin America. It solidified the feeling that the U.S. was more interested in protecting its own interests than in supporting its allies.
And it's not just about hurt feelings, right? This resentment had tangible consequences.
Exactly. It contributed to a growing sense of nationalism and anti-Americanism in some parts of Latin America. It also created an opportunity for other global powers, including the Soviet Union, to step in and try to gain influence. So in a way, the U.S., by focusing so intently on military and political strategies, may have inadvertently pushed Latin America closer to the very ideology they were trying to contain.
Talk about unintended consequences. And speaking of consequences, we can't overlook the human cost of these geopolitical chess matches.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that these policies impacted the lives of millions of people. Behind the grand narratives of the Cold War, there are individual stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. Stories of families torn apart by political turmoil, individuals persecuted for their beliefs, and communities grappling with the economic fallout of these policies.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and treaties, it's about people. Real people whose lives were shaped by these events.
And stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it all together for our listener. We've explored the early Cold War context in Latin America, the shift towards containment, the focus on intelligence gathering, the complex relationships with leaders like Perón, the creation of the Rio Treaty and the OAS, and of course that ever-present tension surrounding the lack of a Marshall Plan for the region.
We've really journeyed through the heart of this historical period, haven't we? And it's clear that the legacy of the Cold War, especially in Latin America, is far from over. Issues of political instability, economic inequality, and the role of the U.S. in the region are still very much alive today.
It's like we're seeing echoes of the past playing out in the present.
Precisely. And that's why understanding this history is so important. It provides context for the challenges facing Latin America today and reminds us that the decisions made by those in power have long-lasting ripple effects.
So as we leave our listener to ponder all of this, what's one final thought-provoking question they should consider? What's the big takeaway they can carry with them?
That's a great question. How about this? Knowing what we know now about the long-term consequences of U.S. policy in Latin America during the Cold War, could a different approach, one that prioritized economic development and social justice, have led to a more stable and prosperous Latin America?
Ooh, that's a good one. It makes you wonder if the U.S. had taken a more holistic approach, addressing not just the military and political threats of communism, but also the underlying economic and social conditions that made it appealing to some. Could they have achieved a different outcome?
It's certainly a question worth pondering. It challenges us to think about the complexities of foreign policy, the importance of considering multiple perspectives, and the unintended consequences of our actions.
And it reminds us that history offers valuable lessons if we're willing to listen.
No.
Well, on that note, I think we've given our listener plenty to chew on.
Yeah, we have. It's like food for thought, right?
But hey, that's what the deep dive is all about.
Absolutely.
Taking a deep dive into complex topics and coming away with more questions than answers.
Exactly. It's about sparking curiosity, encouraging critical thinking, and reminding ourselves that history is never truly settled. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and more connections to make.
And speaking of connections, I think one of the most fascinating aspects of this deep dive has been seeing how the Cold War, something we often associate with Europe and the Soviet Union, played out so differently in Latin America.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the Cold War wasn't just this monolithic global conflict. It was a series of interconnected struggles, each with its own unique dynamics and complexities. And Latin America, with its history of colonialism, its diverse cultures, and its struggles for economic and political independence, offers a particularly rich and often overlooked perspective on this era.
It's like we've zoomed in on a specific region of the world and uncovered this whole hidden layer of history.
Precisely, and by understanding how the Cold War unfolded in Latin America, we gain a deeper appreciation for the global impact of this conflict and its enduring legacies.
Well, I think we've done a fantastic job of guiding our listener through this intricate web of history. We've explored the motivations behind U.S. containment policy, the strategies they employed, the unintended consequences of their actions, and the multiple historical perspectives that shape our understanding of this period.
We've really gone beyond the surface level and delved into the nuances of this complex and fascinating topic. And I hope our listener walks away with a renewed appreciation for the power of history to illuminate our present and inform our future.
Absolutely. So to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into containment and the Cold War in Latin America. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, keep learning.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.